maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
What does it mean to love something? And I mean truly love something. To me, at least when it comes to art, loving something means that I will often subconsciously return back to that thing. Whether it's a melody or the fun game feel, loving something means that it has stuck with me. And I think back on that work of art fondly enough that it never fully leaves my subconscious. For those not in the know, if you're new here, Silent Hill 2, the original at least, is the most meaningful piece of art in my meaningless life. I've made a personal retrospective on what the game means to me for its 20th anniversary, and have referenced the game numerous times throughout my time on YouTube. But there was a long period of my life, from basically around the time I first beat it when I was 13 until right before COVID and lockdown, where I thought of James Sunderland's journey nearly every single day of my life. I consumed and created theories on the game's deep levels of symbolism and metaphor. I watched countless videos about the game, and when I was in my darkest moments throughout a lot of my youth, James Sunderland and the characters along his journey to find his beloved wife were there to provide me comfort, solace, and regulate those intense transitional emotions that I was experiencing. This is just a long-winded way to say that I truly love the original Silent Hill 2. And because of that, it has fallen into the pantheon of art that means so much to me that I do not actively engage with it very often. It is a means to help solidify the emotions that I have tied with that piece of media. I don't want to overwatch a movie that means a lot to the point where it means that a lot of my emotions tied to it have been shaved down like a piece of wood against sandpaper. I find that only sparingly returning to those pieces of media helps maintain that special feeling as best as I can throughout my life. Silent Hill, through the lens of Silent Hill 2, became my own personal special place. One that I would return to for years and years, deliberately or not. I mentioned earlier that around 2020, my engagement with the original Silent Hill 2 had begun to dwindle. It had been nearly 15 years of being obsessed with the game's narrative and characters, and by that point, the series had been so long dead and buried that after a legitimate grieving period, I had begun to accept the franchise's fate of becoming a forgotten relic that would in some ways stay with me forever, but not in a way that meant that it would continue alongside me. But just because I had realistically come to terms with that fact, it didn't mean that I was okay with it. I had heard rumors for years about some sort of return to that town, a return to my special place in some form or another. And after a little while, I had convinced myself that those rumors were true, despite the multiple year-long radio silence from Konami. I craved the foggy streets, the desolate nurture, and the introspective, subtle, and horrific terror that Silent Hill provided me, and that I missed so dearly. And after years of assuming, years and years of dreaming, Silent Hill is back. And I've played and beaten the remake of Silent Hill 2, and I've got a lot to say about it. I'm gonna get the clickbaity nonsense out of the way immediately. I loved the Silent Hill 2 remake. I think it is a fantastic example of what not only a remake should strive to be, but an example of what can be accomplished when people who truly care about the thing that they're working on are given the opportunity and the time.
It is so filled with passion from every single rust-covered metal pipe, all the way down to the tears that stream down James's face during some of the game's endings. There are so many things that the remake does right that during my first playthrough of the game, it sort of shocked me at the consistency of tone, ambience, and characterization that was able to be transferred from the original game. I mean this sincerely when I say it, but the remake of Silent Hill 2 is as good as it possibly could have been. I love the new direction of the characters, the updated soundtracks, the updated combat, the unbelievable and now scene-stealing atmosphere, whether it's the serene fog-covered streets or the nightmarish dungeons that really help bridge together the modern obsession with liminal spaces. The Silent Hill 2 remake doesn't seek to replace the original game, but instead exist alongside it, working essentially as a gateway for a lot of modern players to that original game. There are some things that feel modern. Obviously, you can't escape the new updated combat, alongside the occasional set-piece segments out on the streets, but so much of that original game's soul is still present in this remake. And even if the game around that recaptured soul was mediocre, I think that Bloober should still be commended on a grand scale for doing what we all thought was impossible. Even I, someone who defended the remake's existence from basically its announcement, thought that, to some extent, recapturing that original spirit would be lost in translation. I assumed that it would be different, lesser, or, well, anything other than what we actually got. The original Silent Hill 2 is essentially a martyr for the gaming as an art form crowd. To those who have played it, and even to those who haven't but know the story anyway, it stands as a crowning achievement for storytelling in gaming. Especially when you consider the time of that game's release. It went places that many games hadn't even considered to go, and did so with such elegance, subtlety, and thoughtfulness. I do partly believe that a reason that so many of us old heads who love the game, that played it around the time of its release, are so attached to it in the way that we are, is because that no game at the time really dared to defy our expectations as players in such a subversive, human way. Games around that time were still mostly about saving the world, rescuing a princess, being a hero, or being a villain. My first playthrough of Silent Hill 2 stands out to me because at that time, I had no reason not to trust James Sunderland. I believed that Mary was waiting for me, and that while it may not play out ideally, I would help James find her and successfully fulfill that game's objective. But no game, at least the ones that I had ever played, dared to showcase the human condition and show me the ugly part of what we are all capable of deep down. It wasn't just the characters that you meet, the tragedy that befalls them, or the evil acts that play out in front of you, but the things that James himself had done. When I first beat Silent Hill 2, I sat alone in my parents' house with my head in my hands as the credits rolled and the early morning sunlight poured through the windows as I sat there, shaken to my core from a story told to me through the means of a video game that I had never come close to experiencing. And I know that I am not alone in this feeling because the community surrounding Silent Hill 2 only grew with time, and the fanbase that attached themselves to it began to hold close the ideal that this game was simply perfect. And in some sense, they are right. With a game as expertly crafted as Silent Hill 2, where every aspect of it seems to resonate with either the game's themes of the story or the mechanics of its subgenre, you can feel every little blemish on that game's skin as a smooth surface of perfection. If you look at Silent Hill 2 at the right angle, everything seems to fall in line, and you can believe that the people behind that original game did every single thing for the reason that you believe it to. And really, in that sense, the original Silent Hill 2 is perfect. It's untouchable. The remake of any important horror game, let alone one with the pedigree of Silent Hill 2 being made by a studio such as Bloober Team, was bound to be filled with some sort of controversy and skepticism. But I don't think I was prepared for how vitriolic it got. During the wait for the remake's release, I was bombarded with countless posts of people dogging on Bloober Team from basically every conceivable angle imaginable and objectifying a victim of sexual assault while claiming the most heinous and ridiculous things imaginable towards her and towards the team making the game. People may have their issues with the way that Bloober handles certain topics, specifically the ones that Silent Hill 2 basically relies upon for its narrative, but I couldn't help but feel for everybody involved making this game. But besides the skepticism and the negativity towards Bloober, people's concerns for the game itself were, in my opinion, something to be genuinely concerned about. Remaking the game that I remembered and loved so dearly from over 20 years ago and bringing it to the modern day should have unironically been impossible. There is so much invested into the awkward and stilted dialogue, the character portrayals, the Lynchian atmosphere, and the indescribable feeling of just being in Silent Hill 2, that game being on the PS2 not only elevated, but basically solidified. But nobody could be sure if the game would translate with more modern graphics, controls, and inevitable combat improvements. How could they translate something so firmly held in the collective nostalgia for all of its triumphs and its faults? How can you bring back something so beloved to everybody of today and still expect people like me who love it for what it was after changing it essentially from a part of its soul?
The most shocking thing is that despite the overhaul in the game's combat, Silent Hill 2 now keeps close what mattered the most, which is the game's narrative and its themes, but also the game's tenets of level design. There was always a few criteria that I absolutely advocated for when the remake of Silent Hill 2 was announced. In my opinion, all Bloober had to do was to not touch the story, and I felt that even if the mechanics around the game weren't great, what mattered was the game's narrative above all else. And thankfully, Bloober hardly touched shit, okay? In fact, Bloober did basically what should have led to an absolute disaster despite how minor it might be in hindsight, and that is add to the original game's narrative. And while there are some things that I'm not totally sold on, some of which we'll get to later, I think that the change to the original game's dialogue, tweaks to delivery of the same lines, and some entirely new scenes that have been added are genuinely pitch perfect. It felt like the same game with the same message, just delivered a little bit differently. More real, more grounded, but still unapologetically off. And if I may, real quickly, just gush over some fantastic details that Bloober Team added to Silent Hill 2's story, the lore, and the characters. The use of reflections are a symbolic cue that is used in the original, but in the remake they are much more pronounced. Whether it's James constantly seeing his reflection in the save screens, cutscenes, before and after watching the videotape, the emphasis on staring into yourself is so much more significant to the visual storytelling at play.
I love the subtle detail of James rubbing his palm at the beginning of the game, a subtle visual hint of the act of smothering, but being referenced again after you kill Eddie. In the original game, James goes on a little spiel about having actually killed a human being, but in the remake you just see James rubbing his palm and looking rather morose. If you notice it and you catch it, it conveys an incredible amount of emotion and an excellent touch of showing, not telling. I love the new cutscene with James and Maria in Heaven's Night. In fact, it might be my favorite scene in the entire game. The subtle look that James gives the bottle of liquor, the genuine temptation that he's experiencing, and the battle that you see rage inside his head as he resists that urge to drink. I love that James questions himself in this scene, asking if his reason for being here is even worthwhile or if it makes him an insane person. It's an excellent way of grounding James because up until that point, as a video game, it felt logical for you to be here because, of course, you need to save your dead wife from the afterlife. But at some point, you would be doubting your sanity. I love the added detail of the local folktale that Maria initially tells about, with the man traversing through the lake as he follows a light held by his one true love, and how it ends up betraying the man and ending his life. It gives a significant thematic and literal storytelling context to what happens later in the game when you finally make your way to the hotel, and it feels like a perfectly executed, if not at worst, a bit on the nose addition to the game's story. I love that the use of the song Magdalene is a thing that is recontextualized as potentially a song that Mary used to play on the piano. When you first hear it, it's in Neely's bar, and it seems to trigger a memory for James, indicating that the song holds some sort of prior significance to him and Mary's relationship. And it shows up at multiple points throughout the game, so when you hear it after the long hallway in the basement in the hospital, it packs a significant heavier punch because you have those established connections that were never there in the original game. I love that Eddie from the start seems a little bit distrustworthy. Even though they didn't add any scenes for his character, the transition from the second time you meet him, where he's guzzling ice cream with his bare hands, is a significantly much more sinister scene than the original, allowing, in my opinion, a much more smooth connective tissue for his character. Whereas in the original, the second interaction with him is one of the goofiest and the objectively most meme-ified scene in the original game. Pizza! And then, the next time you see him, he's a full-on murdering psychopath. The subtle tweak to this second interaction really ties his character so much better than the original game. I also love that in any scene with Eddie, you can see his breath, foreshadowing his boss fight where all Eddie sees or is experiencing is this ice-cold freezer that is steadily closing in on him as you progress through the game. I love that right before the Abstract Daddy boss fight, the room that you enter is a reflection of the apartment you enter right before the cutscene with Angela in front of the mirror. But instead of the black door being boarded up and the white door being accessible with Angela behind it, that door is now boarded up, and the only place that you can go is the black door, which leads to Angela's trauma and turmoil. When I first saw this, I actively exclaimed out loud what a brilliant touch this was. Whoa. Oh, that's actually such a good fucking touch. Holy shit. It was absolutely pitch perfect, and I couldn't believe that the original game hadn't done it beforehand. But most of all, the thing that I love most is the remake's version of James. And I cannot believe that I'm saying this, but in my mind, Luke Roberts' portrayal of James Sunderland is officially James Sunderland in my head. He knocks it out of the fucking park. We all love James in the original game as like a meme in some sense or another.
Who's Rachel?
We loved him for his goofball attitude towards certain things and his overactedness that his character exudes due to Guy Seehey's portrayal. But James in the remake comes across as just a likable guy that's currently going through a lot. Every time James is the focus of a cutscene, Luke Roberts steals the fucking show. And that is nothing to say about the other actors involved. Every actor and actress gives it their all. And while not every scene was to my unbelievably high expectations, there are a lot of classic scenes that, in my opinion, have been improved on. It's an insane thing to experience some of these classic scenes being conveyed in normal-ish voice acting, but I think that in most circumstances, it works in the remake's favor. And one of the biggest worries for me regarding this remake might seem trivial to a lot of people, but to me it helped make the original game what it was. And that is the notes and messages that you find scrawled around the town.
One of my absolute favorite things about Silent Hill has always been the notes, the riddles, and messages that you find throughout your journey. And in the original Silent Hill 2, I think that concept was pretty much perfected. A lot of modern horror games, including ones made by Bloober beforehand, tend to try to replicate this idea in their own games. Now, I've not played a lot of Bloober Team's other games, but the one that I have played and beaten is the original Layers of Fear, and the trap that I think most of these examples, especially Layers of Fear, fall into is the fact that these games use these notes and messages as a substitute for narrative storytelling. What the original game did so perfectly with this concept is that all of these messages and notes, whether they were just a creepy note that you find on the floor of a hospital or part of a puzzle, is that they never literally contributed to the game's narrative, but instead focused and highlight the game's themes in an unsettling way. The original game is filled to the brim with puzzles referencing individuals, whether it's the clock puzzle with Henry, Mildred, and Scott, the entire hospital consistently referencing 3 separate and important patients, the prison with its instances of the glutton, seductress, and the oppressor, and many of these puzzles have much in common with the themes of the game, including guilt, trauma, repentance, and punishment. You have to make the connections yourself, but even if you couldn't or didn't consider the thematic relevancy, you could still find the fulfillment in these notes from their sheer unsettling nature alone. I think only second to the game's narrative are the importance of these. Something else that I have always liked about the original game's implementation of these even goes beyond their thematic relevance to the game's story, but what it does is help flesh out the world of Silent Hill. It's a tremendous amount of world building with very little actual effort. You can learn about the history of the town and what may or may not have happened to its residents, and it gives off this feeling that everyone seemingly abandoned the town all at once, or at the same time, it can give credence to the idea that maybe you really are just walking around a completely normal town, oblivious to the normalcy going on around you. There are only a few instances of the messages that you find in the town being directly related to James, and the most famous of which being the eerie message that you find in Neely's bar, if you decide to make the trek back after the hospital. Now, say what you will about the effectiveness of that message, or if it contradicts what I'm about to say later, but to me, there is something deeply haunting of this being one of the only times in the entire game that the town itself seems to be treating James like a toy, playing with him and in turn making you, the player, feel directly threatened by something other than just the monsters. It's the first instance where you feel like the town itself is messing with you and that there might be something deeper going on. And it's because of Bloober Team's previous games and their iterations of this concept that made me worried that this aspect of the original game might be lost. I feared that the notes that you'd find or the messages that you'd read would be irrefutably related to James Sunderland. The now infamous combat trailer leading up to the game's release didn't quell my worries about this either, with the "reap what you sow" appearing on the wall, seemingly taunting James directly. While it does basically the same thing as the Neely's Bar message, something about it felt amateurish, and it was genuinely something that I was worried about transferring into the remake. In the days leading up to the remake's release, I would accidentally come across people sharing screenshots of some of the messages that you would find in the game's opening hours, and people would say things that seemed to confirm my fears, such as apparently directly relaying the drugs that Mary was taking during her time with the disease, and potentially confirming the loop theory by saying that a message that you find alluding to Pyramid Head was James himself writing from another failed attempt. But to my surprise and joy, I think that Bloober actually knocked this aspect out of the park. I can happily confirm that these notes are there and can be linked to James Sunderland and his wife's disease, or his potentially infinite encounters with the Red Pyramid thing, but there is nothing there except the game's narrative itself to make those connections. So many of the notes that you find in the game just flesh out the world in the right way. The messages that you find in the apartments just give little glimpses into some of the lives of the residents and even hint at some of the power of the town itself, such as the note detailing the report of the resident being asked about the gunfire in their apartment. The notes that you find in the hospital are essentially all about the 3 crucial patients that are important to the main puzzle of the first section of that dungeon, and by the time that you reach the Otherworld hospital, the notes truly descend into madness, with each patient's detailing the horrific things that they're being forced to undergo at the hospital. But it's likely that it's just them suffering from the effects of the Otherworld overlapping with the reality that the doctors are inhabiting. The prison does something similar, with notes talking about a deadly disease spreading among the prisoners and the staff having no idea what's going on, again potentially linked to the Otherworld itself. It's all brilliantly done and genuinely exceeded all expectations that I had for this aspect of the game. Bloober Team did justice to what made those old notes and documents feel tied to Silent Hill of old. They should be applauded for this execution on this aspect. Now, these points that I've brought up until this point have been exclusive to the narrative. But what about the gameplay? There are 2 things in particular regarding this aspect that I want to highlight: the level design and the combat. I'll cover level design first because I think that combat was the biggest concern that people had about the remake other than the narrative. But in my eyes, the level design and the feeling of wandering around the town were some of the most crucial aspects of the game to me, arguably more important than whatever the combat ended up being. And that's partly because what makes old school survival horror games feel the way that they do, mechanically at least, is the puzzle box design that Resident Evil popularized. Silent Hill, with its several intricately designed dungeon levels, feels a bit more like a spooky Legend of Zelda in terms of its game layout, but its dungeons such as the Midwich School from Silent Hill 1 or the Lakeview Hotel in Silent Hill 2 always retained that puzzle box design, albeit in a much more condensed version. You're essentially traversing several small Spencer mansions, each with their own puzzles, unique visual design, and aesthetic. Now, with modern survival horror games, one of my biggest fears regarding the remake was that Bloober was going to essentially do what I like to call treadmill backtracking, which is something that I find a lot of modern big-budget horror games have been leading towards, with one of the biggest examples in recent memory being Resident Evil Village. Treadmill backtracking is when a game gives the illusion of backtracking, but in essence you are still being guided on a linear, singular pathway. You'll find a locked door and basically turn around, go through another door, and that door will lead you to a key that unlocks the previous door, but the hallway you're already going down loops back around to the previous locked door. The game gave you the item, told you where to use the item, and basically held your hand the entire way to that door. While there's nothing inherently wrong with this type of design, to me, in a survival horror game, it feels like a half-baked execution on a classic system. The fulfillment of being lost and discovering an item that opens up a door or helps you finally finish a puzzle, and having to open up your map and think about your game plan of how to get back to where those items are needed is an acquired taste, but if that taste is something that you want, there's really nothing else like it. The Resident Evil 2 remake, funnily enough, in contrast to Village, is one of the very few games that, in my opinion, truly succeeded in transferring the old school feel of backtracking and translating it into the modern day. And it's my favorite modern Resident Evil game by a million miles. The Silent Hill 2 remake, to my surprise and enjoyment, for the most part, does an excellent job of bringing this same sense of backtracking to the modern day. There are a few instances here and there that genuinely feel disappointing in this regard, such as the canned puzzle in the apartment complex. While I'll never deny that the original game's version of this puzzle is rather non-intuitive and pretty bizarre, I find it incredibly disappointing that Bloober decided to keep this puzzle at all if all they were going to do is put the can of juice in the same room as the garbage chute, which barely makes it a puzzle at all. I don't even feel comfortable counting it as one. But I want to focus on one area of the game in particular where it peaks in terms of level design, and it feels like it came straight out of the mindset of an early 2000s horror game. It's my favorite level in the game, the hospital. From the start of the dungeon, only a very small portion of the building is explorable. You're set on a relatively linear pathway until you get the power back on and take the elevator up to the 3rd floor. Afterwards, the level begins to open up to you, and you are constantly in a state of requiring new items in order to progress, and the backtracking never feels cheap or annoying. You have to solve puzzles in one part of the hospital that will give you an item that you have to use on the other side, and it never feels like wasted time. I always felt the appropriate levels of being lost, and never once felt frustrated or annoyed that I wasn't making progress within its hallways. Its individual story being told through the doctor and his 3 clinical patients feels ominous, unsettling, and at times a gross look at what practices have been done in our real-life past to mental patients in the early 20th century. Enemy placement is also excellent throughout the hospital, always making you feel at danger at almost any given second throughout your exploration, and the redesigned Flesh Lips boss is pretty much a strict upgrade in terms of boss design. The hospital is truly a testament to what made those old school survival horror games' level designs stand the test of time. Now, is this game perfect in its resurrection of this old school sensibility? Absolutely not. And to be honest, the part of the game that hurt me the most is the labyrinth, because it takes what was a creepy location and really gamifies it to the point of annoyance. The labyrinth in the original game was a short, condensed mindfuck of a level where James never finds a map, but instead draws one himself. It's filled with maze-like layouts and constantly find yourself climbing up and down ladders, leading you to what appears to be a water-infested cave crawling with enemies. It made sense to breeze past a level like this from a design mindset, because at this point of the original game, you are quickly heading towards the conclusion. As Uncle Derek showcased in his excellent video talking about the Historical Society section of the original game, that entire section, let alone just the labyrinth, does a lot within its very short runtime. But the labyrinth in the remake isn't just bad to me in some easily definable way, because what makes it disappointing is calling back to my qualms with the modern Resident Evil game's level design and its odd segmenting of its game world. In Resident Evil Village, you have the village itself, which acts as a hub that definitely has the most backtracking involved with all of its wells and locked shrines. The castle is a classic old-school Resident Evil style puzzle box, but filled with treadmill backtracking. And then you have an odd psychological horror escape room, followed by what is essentially a singular boss rush of a level, and then capped off with another old-school style puzzle box, albeit with some legit backtracking. To me, this mishmash of concepts and gameplay elements back to back to back just distracts from what the game is trying to be, and it never lets me stew in its systems and get a feel for them, or bask in the game's atmosphere long enough for me to get a vibe. What bothers me about the modern labyrinth is that despite the awesome reiteration of the cube face puzzle being used as a way to navigate the entire level, instead you're just essentially completing chapters instead of solving a puzzle box. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but these individual bits and pieces range from good to bad. The worst area is likely the first one you enter, where you have to go and find 3 items that will combine together to light a rope that will loosen the chest that breaks apart the floor. This entire area is filled to the brim with the Mandarin enemy, and you're constantly being chased with little to no way to defend yourself. The whole time you're just trying to outrun everything while
at the same time trying to find the items that you need, and it just feels tedious. In contrast, the best area of the labyrinth is probably the second area, where you have to get the key to open up the gated hallway with the valve. This chapter feels like the most condensed puzzle box and makes me wish that the whole level was more like this, or that the entire labyrinth had been laid out in a way where you use the cube puzzle as a centerpiece to navigate between the three areas. It's the only part of the game's level design that, in my opinion, feels lazy, because in comparison to how naturally fleshed out everything else in the game feels, the labyrinth comes across as like a gross miscalculation. And that is something that I want to touch on real fast, because I have heard so many people complain that this game is way too long or too bloated. I think that as it stands, the game is only really too long on your first playthrough of the game. My first run was something like 18 to 19 hours, which is long for a survival horror game, pushing to the lengths of Alien Isolation, a game that, in my opinion, does not really earn that long of a runtime. But Silent Hill 2 Remake is constantly evolving and throwing new puzzles and occasionally new variants on enemies, as well as bosses, and the ever-shifting and evolving story. My second run of Silent Hill 2 Remake, though, clocked in at roughly 13 hours, which is still a longer horror game, but I think that the 9 to 12 hour mark is roughly the length that someone spends on their very first time with the original game. I think the remake sorta gets to have its cake and eat it too by allowing you to really take your time with and feel everything that it wants you to feel on that first run through, and then afterwards you get the more stripped down, quicker experience where you get to focus on whatever aspect of the game that you want to focus on. Which leads me to my last point regarding the level design, and that is the town of Silent Hill itself. The original game did a lot with very little in this regard, but ever since my very first playthrough of the original game, I wanted to explore this town as much as possible. All I wanted in a remake of Silent Hill 2, literally more than anything, was to be able to finally accomplish that dream. So imagine my weak, trembling knees when I heard that you were going to be able to do just that in the remake. But what did I think about the execution of it? Well, it's a little weird because the opening hours of the game is practically everything I wanted. You have optional buildings to enter, usually for supplies and later for some New Game Plus ending items, as well as just being forced to explore new and larger areas like the smaller apartment complex before entering the Blue Creek apartments. You also get to enter places such as Groovy Music and Happy Burger for the first time. Some of the optional areas even require you to solve a puzzle for you to enter. I was floored in my first few hours and imagined the potential optional areas that you'll get to explore later in the game. As the remake went on, however, it slowly began to sink in that the bullet point of exploring more of the town came across as a bit of a deception. Well, yes, the first few hours up until the two apartment complexes are practically everything I wanted. The game severely limits the amount of optional places you can go to almost immediately after leaving Blue Creek Apartments. The optional areas dwindle to about 2 or 3 locations in between the apartments and the hospital, and then, to my recollection, no optional areas at all in between the hospital and the Historical Society, and by that point, you're on a straight line to the hotel. If Bloober Team hadn't succeeded in so many other aspects of this remake, I would be much harsher on them than I am, because this really does feel like a rug pull, at least from a marketing standpoint. Is this possibly my own preconceived expectations hindering my satisfaction? Yeah, maybe. Does it still feel like a disappointment though, regardless? Yeah. I hold out hope that one day we'll get a Silent Hill game that does what Downpour attempted and succeeded on, kind of, by making a mostly fully explorable town with stuff to find and storylines to uncover. But today is unfortunately not that day. But now, let's finally get around to talking about that other big gameplay component that had everyone in a tizzy up until the release, and that is the combat. Bloober Team must have looked at the game with a serious, critical lens, because what they decided to critically change and attempt to improve upon wasn't just the gameplay, but the survival horror itself. The original Silent Hill 2, essentially, from its mechanical core, is potentially one of the easiest games ever made. I genuinely do not know a single person who has ever played the original game with any real previous experience in video games, let alone survival horror games, that has died more than like once or twice, outside of maybe an instant kill attack from Pyramid Head. Even on hard mode, the game will bombard you with ammo and healing supplies, even if you do the most surface level of exploration. And even if you stick to the main path of the game and decide to do what the general consensus tells you, which is to avoid as many fights as possible, then you most likely will never die. Unlike Resident Evil with its inventory management and difficult choices regarding your character's pockets, Silent Hill has never had this issue and instead has always focused on the psychological horror aspects as its main ingredient of terror. There's nothing wrong with this, obviously, as Resident Evil has always been a mechanics-first horror. But to me, calling Silent Hill, and especially Silent Hill 2, as a survival horror has always felt disingenuous. What Bloober managed to accomplish with this remake is remind Silent Hill 2 to put the survival back into survival horror. And what is more impressive is that they didn't just make it feel like Resident Evil with its inventory management, because in that regard, it is still so clearly Silent Hill. You have infinite pockets. You have no limit on what you can carry, but basically all they did was two very specific things. One, tweak the amount of supplies that you'll be gathering throughout your playthrough to be significantly more limited, and two, drastically overhaul the combat. Now, say whatever you will about how survival horror the original 3 games in the series may be, but one thing has always confused me about people's defense about the game's combat. The melee combat is clunky and awkward, and really does help exemplify the idea that James is just a normal schlub who has no combat experience, is not a trained police officer, and is sure as hell not Leon S. Kennedy. Even as someone who has beaten the original game upwards of 10 times, even I still have some difficulty successfully doing heavy melee attacks as opposed to the normal light attack. The melee combat is what everyone says the original game's combat is. Clunky, awkward, stilted, bad. But when you think about what else it is that the original game does, this sort of mythically held belief that the game's combat is bad on purpose or that James is just an everyman sort of falls apart. James can snipe enemies with his guns from down a hallway in a dark corner with little to no effort. He could run past basically every normal enemy in the game with practically zero consequences. Normal enemies do only take a few swings from your melee weapon before collapsing onto the ground, asking to be stepped on, which in turn helps build your immense ammo supply. And did you know that James can snipe enemies with his guns from down a hallway in a dark corner with little to no effort? Do you see what I'm getting at here? A simple implementation to improve upon the original game here in this aspect is just simply severely limiting your resources. Throughout my first playthrough of the game on hard combat, I was always scrounging for any sort of healing items. I was hardly ever at full health, and my ammo count would occasionally surge in numbers, allowing me a brief respite of danger, but after a single boss fight, or even just a room with 2 or more enemies, I would usually be floundering yet again with scarce ammo, and usually even less on health items. This means that every single encounter with an enemy would be one that was filled with tension, potential dread, and the threat of death at basically every single instance. Sure, going into the game on hard mode meant that I would struggle by default with a higher learning curve, because enemies would likely be a lot more aggressive, but honestly, on my second playthrough on normal, the enemies are still threatening enough that I'm usually taking multiple hits per combat, especially in the late game. This leaves the player scrounging and exploring as much as possible for as many resources as they can find. Does this slow the pace of the game down? Yeah, I can't argue that it doesn't, but what it does do very effectively is not only allow the player to feel the atmosphere a bit more than they likely would have otherwise by forcing them to explore, but it really hammers home the threat that the town is presenting to you. It makes every single encounter a life or death scenario, and the new combat system only hammers home this idea. Now, I've heard people say that the modern combat system makes James too competent at combat, and that erases the intention of the original systems, and the one aspect of the original game where those intentions were, in my opinion, at their strongest. And while I would never say that it's an objectively better solution, what I can say is that, in my opinion, Bloober managed to successfully pull off a rather impressive juggling act of making the combat more fluid, more responsive, and better feeling overall, yet still maintain that clunky and awkward feeling without sacrificing much in the process. From the very what am I doing? From the very first reveal of the game during a dev interview, when they showcased about 1 second of combat footage, it seemed apparent that they were going to be essentially lifting a lot of ideas from Silent Hill Homecoming. And having beaten the remake twice at this point, I can say, yeah, they basically just made Homecoming's combat good. But what does that mean? How does making a combat system from a game feel better and yet still maintain that original game's intention? Well, it's one thing to just sit here and say the combat in Homecoming is bad, but what makes it bad is a couple things. First, it tries to juggle way too much for what the system is doing. Homecoming essentially locks you in on a one-on-one enemy and allows you to sidestep dodge to avoid attacks. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but the game doesn't allow for much telegraphing of attacks, or will constantly try to gamify the combat in a way where you have to constantly deal with enemies that you can't damage because the enemies are in a constant state of not being able to damage, usually in the form of some sort of shield mechanic that they have. You can't hit the scissor enemies until a very specific windows allow you. As another example, you can't even shoot the knockoff flying figures until their chest opens up. Now, not every enemy in Homecoming has this issue, but what makes every combat encounter in the game frustrating, especially when compared to the Silent Hill 2 remake, is the fact that your dodge is almost useless, and not in a favorable way. My time playing Homecoming with my video on it a couple years ago was filled to the brim with me trying to dodge enemy attacks, but the game would not even allow me to dodge in the direction that I was trying to, forcing damage on me, rendering the entire dodge system borderline useless. The focus of chain attacks on top of everything makes the game's combat a solid framework at best, but with an entire game built around it, the game just becomes an annoying, tedious slog where every combat encounter is, I guess, scary, but never in the way that you want it to be. You want to feel on the back foot in every combat encounter, but if you do ever feel that way in Homecoming, it's only because the game's systems are annoying and broken. And that is different from intentionally clunky, but usable, which is what I would consider the original combat in Silent Hill 2 to be. Now, as a small side, I decided to play another game entirely for this section of the video to get an idea of what a potential middle ground could be between Homecoming and the remake. The Callisto Protocol. It was given to me for free on Epic, and I've heard from people that the Silent Hill 2 remake's combat reminds them of Callisto Protocol, but generally people seem to like it a little bit more. So I thought I should at least get a sense for what people didn't like that was improved upon. And it's really interesting because for a good chunk of time, I wasn't really feeling Callisto myself either. It's honestly sort of wild to see how much connected tissue there is between the Silent Hill 2 remake and this game in hindsight. The dodging, while being very similar, does actively feel completely different. I don't know how else to explain my thought about that game's combat to contrast with Silent Hill 2 Remake's combat without at least going into it briefly. I promise I'll make this very quick. I swear, I promise. Love you. What makes these two games, Silent Hill 2 Remake and Callisto, so tangential is their emphasis on direct melee combat and their focus on timing and directional dodging. On paper, it might sound like Dark Souls. I put it on the board, I did it. But at best, it's simply an inspiration. It feels much more akin, at least in my opinion, of what I think a modern iteration of a Manhunt sequel would play out like, or even going as far as to say a third-person sequel to the Condemned series. Callisto, for all of the things it doesn't do very well, the groundwork for that game's combat is, in my opinion, actually kinda solid. But its execution of it is rather strange because while you do dodge side to side to avoid attacks, all the game asks of you is to hold your control stick in one direction or the other. There's no necessary timing input or anything like that. Start an encounter, hold the stick to the left, and when you dodge, begin holding it to the right. If you're any good at reading enemy attacks, then it's basically impossible for the game to hit you. It's a bizarre, lackadaisical requirement for player input. While interesting, it puts it in this bizarre, uncanny valley of intuitiveness. You feel the intensity of the combat in the heat of the moment, but at the same time, you're barely putting in any effort to do so. Silent Hill 2 Remake, while likely not ripping off Callisto, has essentially given that game's combat a what-if scenario by keeping the same mechanical emphasis, but making the dodging much more on the player by requiring a button input as well as a directional press in order for them to dodge. If you don't dodge in time, and if you don't learn the enemy's attack patterns, then you will get your shit rocked in, which happened on my first playthrough a lot. Oh! Bro, are you fucking kidding me? Now, this is where a rabble-rally of internet voices begin chanting at me like the loud, thunderous cries of a flock of warhawks, telling me that this updated melee combat goes against the spirit of the original game and that James shouldn't have this much agency in the combat. By allowing this much freedom of movement and giving James the ability to dodge enemy attacks goes against the James is an everyman narrative that the original game's melee combat, even I'll admit, helped emphasize. And I think it's important to note that the remake system, while significantly changed from the original game and feeling much more modern in comparison, still retains the feeling of a survival horror game, mostly on account of two simple things. One, the combat may have a flow or a rhythm that you can learn and get proficient in, but if you are facing multiple enemies, that flow is tricky to find. You will likely fall into a panic state rather quickly. Even if you are only facing one enemy, a single slip-up in timing or an attack can equate to you getting your skull rocked, dealing massive damage to you. This means that the combat never feels boring or too predictable. Even if you find a flow, you have to maintain that flow. Otherwise, suffer. 2. This emphasis on a much more overtly aggressive combat means that it's much more difficult to avoid enemies like you could in the original game. It also means that your resources will likely be held at ransom at all times. If you have enough health to feel confident to go into a melee combat, then you will likely end up either the same on the other side of that combat or needing to heal. If you're low on health before entering combat, odds are you will try to use some of your guns to raise your chances of survival. But that still doesn't mean you're going to come out unscathed. No matter what, the game's new combat system is designed around draining away your resources at all times, which makes the combat encounters feel frightening, tense, and usually leaving you on the back foot, if not starting them on it. Mechanically, there is very little here that I have issue with. One of the only parts of the game that was genuinely disappointing to me was, like I said, the remake's interpretation of the Labyrinth. But the Labyrinth also leaves me with a very mixed feeling on a very specific aspect that I see being praised up and down. And while I think it's a fine segment in its own right, I just want to get my opinion out there on it. Because I'm not the biggest fan of the Abstract Daddy boss fight. My second playthrough of the game left me much more positive than I was initially about the fight, but I think that my issue with it still remains to some extent. To me, the original game's Abstract Daddy fight is essentially the best example of show don't tell when it comes to what it symbolizes and what it does to the characters. You understand what's being said, but the game doesn't tell you any of it. It's a small room with thrusting pistons and arguably the most disturbing monster in the game and the most tragic character being paired with it. The cutscene that plays afterwards says as much as the game ever needed to say about Angela's character for you to infer her past. And at the same time, it's even arguable that this is the point of the game that is the most overt in directly telling the player what it's getting across outside of the ending hallway in the hotel. It's not hard to come away with at least some idea about Angela's past with what is presented in the original game. But it's still subtle. It's still simple. But in the remake, it tackles the boss fight and the story beat in a way that just feels way too bombastic. You're running around in what is clearly supposed to be Angela's old apartment and evading the abstract daddy in likely the same manner that Angela was as a child. You're getting these weird hallways that are filled to the brim with cinematic level designs as you traverse between TVs that are playing audio of Angela's childhood or potentially the last conversation that they ever had before Angela made her way to Silent Hill as her father berates her. There's nothing that is outright bad in anything that I've said, but to me, this remake spikes here in a way that doesn't feel appropriate for what the scene is doing. It may have said the same thing as the original, but in one of the very few ways that didn't actively click with me in the way it decided to say it. But this is where we move from the subjective interpretation of the objective and start to move into the terrifying and self-destructive void of nostalgia. The original Silent Hill 2, if it already isn't apparent enough, is something that I could never in a million years look at with any feigned objectivity, even if my life depended on it. Every single scene and inflection is engraved in my mind with the permanency of an epitaph on a tombstone. Say what you will about those old voice actors, but their ethereal delivery and off-kilter performances are so resonant with who I am as a person that removing myself from the equation to evaluate them is not possible. Silent Hill 2, the original, is perfect, and not just in its imperfections, but really from the core of its design and its execution of those concepts and ideas, which makes this remake a really emotionally confusing thing for me to evaluate. How is it possible for me to look objectively at this game that I love so much and tell you what really works or absolutely does not? The answer is through a remake. Looking at this old thing through a new lens is the only way that I could ever hope to look at this old story and declare anything as good or bad. But now this poses its own confliction in me because how can I look at this remake without my attachment to that old game? It may be impossible, but I tried my hardest in order to do that. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I did end up loving the remake and pretty much all that it did to improve on the mechanics of that old classic. But now what? The game that is self-admitted to mean more than anything in the world to me, that has always been clunky and awkward, now has a remake that suddenly makes the game fun? This may sound silly, but this is really a difficult thing for me to engage with, if I'm being honest. This video has been one of the hardest for me to write, and it's because of this aspect. Silent Hill 2's story is so central to who I am as a person. I have been so lost before in life, with this narrative as the only course of some sort of self-reflection during those dark periods. The messages and the symbolism that is central to this game's narrative is something I would never want in over 1,000 years to lose an impact. So what do I do now that this game is so much more engaging and fun to play? Do I allow that impact of the original game to wear down on me and enjoy the game as a game? Silent Hill 2 has never been a game to me, despite its medium. It has always been the single most personal story I've ever encountered, and suddenly enjoying it for its mechanics feels disingenuous to everything that it stands for to me. My issue is that with all of these recent remakes that have come out as of late, I have enjoyed a lot of them. The Dead Space remake, the Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes, as well as the System Shock remake, have all been games that I've loved a lot. But the only games in this little batch of remakes that I've played that have any sort of real, genuine nostalgia with me are the Resident Evil 2 and the Resident Evil 4 remake. I've never been more hyped for a game than I was for the Resident Evil 2 remake. But nothing could distract me from the fact that, even with my nostalgia set aside, the game just wasn't as clean to play through because of its significantly harder difficulty, as well as Mr. X being a nuisance more than anything in the grand scheme of things. The Resident Evil 4 remake, however, eclipsed the original for me. I prefer it in most categories that you could fit in over the original. And with the Silent Hill 2 remake, I can't deny that while my hype started cautiously optimistic at first, as time went on, I couldn't help but succumb to this idea of what Silent Hill 2 remake could be in my head. What I'm trying to get at is that I think I went into this remake hoping that it would, in some sense, replace the original. I wanted this game to become the only one in my mind because I knew it was going to be so much more modern and slick. I wanted this remake to be what Resident Evil 4 was a year ago for me. But nostalgia can get in the way of things. It can bring the happiest memories out of you, but it can taint the things in front of you if you aren't careful. I let nostalgia get in the way of me during my first playthrough of this game. Obviously not really in the mechanical sense, but where it mattered the most, in the emotional one. I preferred the old camera movement to the Eddie scene before the boss fight. I preferred the way that Angela broke down in front of James after the Abstract Daddy boss fight. I preferred the original Maria outburst in the hospital, and I preferred the fire-infested staircase scene with Angela. All of these things was nostalgia getting in the way of me appreciating what was right in front of me. The funny thing, however, is that I don't think Bloober wanted to make something that would replace the original. I read a preview article before the game came out where the lead director, and I'm sorry if I butchered this name, Matthias Lennart, basically explained his thought process for tackling the remake. What he said was, "What helped me was to imagine we are not going back to 2001, but imagine a situation that James is still inside Silent Hill after 20 years. He's in this constant loop. The nightmare still repeats. The nightmare changes details, but the outcome is always the same. That opened doors for me." And that statement becomes clear if you set nostalgia aside and look at Silent Hill 2 Remake for what it is. My nostalgia for the original game will never falter because of the impact it has had on me. Nothing can replicate that magic. But at some point I did forget that this game was filled with its own magic that I just wasn't seeing. This remake isn't a what if or even a reimagining. It's a love letter and a sequel at the same time. Silent Hill 2 came back into my life through this remake in a time when its story was self-proclaimed to be slipping on its impact for me. However big or small that slip may have been. Despite its imperfections, the Silent Hill 2 remake, just like the original, is in its own way perfect. The lines may have changed, the characters may have changed appearance, the deliveries of lines ingrained in my brain have changed, or the inflections that they're delivered with may have changed. But that's just nostalgia. Only time will tell if newer players introduced to this story through this remake will still feel the way that I did over 20 years ago. I'd like to think that nostalgia will blind them too.
Tomato is a fruit, but it also a vegetable.